Um, my grandfather, I was at home with my two sisters and my cousin, young lady, and thank you very much. Oh, it's working. Cool. Thank you very much. Man, let's give it up for Matt. Yeah, the guy, he just fixes everything. Just everything. Hate that about him. No, I'm just kidding. I can't fix anything. He fixes everything. No. We were home. My parents weren't home. And my grandfather and my step-grandmother showed up to the house. And we saw them. We saw them. And because at my house, we had large front windows. So we saw them pull up. And we were, again, I was a teenager. My sisters were a little bit younger than me. My cousin that was there was a little bit older than me, and we scrambled, and we ran to the room, and we heard my grandpa knocking on the door, and hello, hello, old Mexican man, hello, and we scrambled because we didn't want to have to host him. It's like, what are we going to talk about? And this was a grandpa that we didn't see too often. We didn't spend a lot of time with him, so we weren't real close. And we went so far as, between me and my sisters and my cousin, we came up with this scheme. All right, here's what we're going to do. We're gonna jump out the back window of the bedroom, and we're going to hop the fence and there was an apartment complex behind us, and then we'll walk back around, and maybe our parents, my parents will be back by then, and we won't have to host my grandpa and try and come up with, what, I don't know, what are we going to say to grandpa? We didn't know him all that well. And so we found ourselves at the bedroom window, it's opened up, and right underneath the bedroom window was this big, it wasn't a rose bush, but it was like this real thorny bush. Had some flowers on it, but not roses. And I just remember, it's like, all right, I'll go first, and I jump off into the yard, and then watching my cousin and my sisters up there on the window, and it was like, oh, we got to try and jump over this thing, and everybody's trying to clear the thorn bush, and we finally did, and we climbed over the back fence. That was another whole feat, and it was like, we get over there finally, and we walk through the apartments over towards the school, and we come back around. And we come walking up the street and came up with this whole story like, oh, we didn't know you were going to be here. We were doing this and doing that, and just came up with this big old lie is what it was. Again, we weren't Christians at the time. And all of that because we just didn't want to sit there awkward with our grandpa and my step-grandma, his wife, my step-grandma. Visits sometimes. Sometimes you absolutely love visits, right? Sunday after church, you and your friend from church, hey, we're going to hang out, we're going to go to the mall, or you're going to come over and play video games, or we're going to go to the movies and hang out at my house after, or we're going to go home and have a movie night. Sometimes you love them. And then there are other visits, and I know because I've talked to some of you, that you dread. It's like, oh man, so-and-so's coming over, or, these family friends are coming over, and I don't want to be there, and it's just this whole thing. Visits are just it's like this whole fascinating area of life. We love them, we hate them. It's, I don't know, is, awkward, I'm not really sure, or whatever, and we can make such a big deal about it, right? And sometimes they are a really, really big deal. Paul, I'm saying all of this because Paul, as we finish up 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul is going to be talking about his visit. He's planning for the third time, he's making plans to go and visit the Corinthians. And the truth is that with this visit, there's some hesitation on his part because he's not sure if it's going to be a good visit or if it's going to be an awkward visit, or if it's going to be a bad visit. So that's what that's all about. Now, let's see. I think this is working here so that Candace doesn't have to mess with the slides here. For those of you that take notes, chapter 12 was broken up into two main divisions. The first one was vision, and we saw that last week. And then tonight we'll finish up with visit, and we'll pick it up at verse 14. And let's see if we can get to that slide. There it is, verses 14 through 21, the visit. Dun, 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 dun. Let's see what kind of visit this is. If it's like the one that has you jumping over thorned bushes to avoid someone, or if it's a pleasant visit. Paul here in verse 14 is he's nearing the end of the book of 2 Corinthians. There actually is only one more chapter after this. And so he's nearing the end, and so he's saying, hey, I'm planning to come for a visit. What kind of visit is it going to be? Now in verse 14, he says this, now for the third time, I am ready to come to you. Now does that mean that he had actually visited 2 or 3 times, or was he just making plans for the third time to try and get there to visit? We're not exactly sure, but he says there very clearly, now for the third time, I am ready to come to you. And he says, and I will not be burdensome to you. For I do not seek yours, but you. For the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children. This is actually, strange as it may seem, is one of my favorite verses. I've actually used this verse lots of times over the years when I've had the opportunity to go teach somewhere. I always like to, if I'm going to teach, for one of my pastor friends, youth pastor friends, I always like to just go and do it for free. I do that because, I'm independently wealthy. Just kidding, I'm not. Okay? But just being able to go and give something like that. And so I've shared this with them like, hey, it's my pleasure to do this. Here's what Paul is saying here, okay? With this visit, what Paul is saying here in verses 14 all the way down to verse 19, he's going to explain this parental provision. Look what he says here again, verse 14. He says, now for the third time I'm ready to come to you, and I will not be burdensome to you. I'm not going to be a burden when I come to visit. Sometimes when you have family come and live with you, that can be a little bit burdensome, huh? Seems fun at first. Maybe your cousins are coming over or something, and yeah, you guys are going to hang out for the weekend or whatever. But then you realize that they're cutting in on your bathroom time. And, well, man, I'm usually in there right now doing my hair, or I'm, trying to get in there to get my toothbrush, and, they're, doing things in the bathroom. It's like, what's going on, and sometimes it's burdensome. Paul says that when I come, it is not going to be burdensome to you. Paul doesn't want to burden the Corinthians. So he's coming, and here's what he says, for I do not seek yours, but you. Now, he talks about burdensome. Later on, he's going to talk about spending. He's going to talk about Titus not taking advantage. All of these words and all of these terms that Paul is using have to do with money, finances, actually. And he's saying that when I come to visit, I'm not going to be charging you guys any kind of money. I'm not going to be burdensome to you in that way. It is a parental provision, a parental thing to save on behalf of your kids. Let's look at that in verse 14. For the children ought not to lay up. That phrase, lay up, those two words, means to store up or to build a mound. And he says, for the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children. Now, this is not a passage or a verse on parenting. But we certainly do learn something about parenting here, one little aspect, and Paul borrows, as he so often does. Sometimes he takes from the sports world. Sometimes he'll talk about farming. He'll use an illustration for farming. This time he takes a picture or an illustration of a parent. What is a parent supposed to do? This is something that parents do. The children do not save up for their parents, but it's the parents who are saving up for the children. It's the parents who are providing for the children in their younger years. There may in fact come a time when you, as the son or daughter, as you grow older, that you start to save because you realize that mom or pops, they're like, okay, they're getting old, and we might have to bring them in to live with us. Some of you might be living in that situation right now, where grandma and grandpa live with you, because it's a help to them, a blessing to them, because mom and dad want to take care of their parents. It's a sweet thing. But what Paul, the picture that Paul is using is of young children. And he's saying, listen, the way this works is we don't have kids as built-in slaves. Hey, we got kids. Woohoo, all right, I never have to paint the house again. Get in there, kid, But I'm only 2. I don't care, you can hold that paintbrush, get in there, That's not what kids are for. The way that it is supposed to work is that, generally speaking, the parents are the ones that are providing parental provision, that are providing for the kids. And that's what Paul is talking about here. And he's using that illustration to share with the Corinthians, listen, I'm coming to visit. But I'm not coming to collect money from you guys. I'm not coming to get paid. I'm not going to be burdensome to you. I'm coming with the mindset that Paul is saying, I'm coming as the parent, I'm coming in the parent position, and you guys, the Corinthians, you're like my kids. And so I'm coming here to Corinth in order to provide for you. I want to do something for you. And so Paul makes that clear. That would have been something that settled the hearts of the Corinthians. You see, those of you that have been going through 2 Corinthians know this, that the Corinthians were actually questioning Paul's motives. They had actually been listening to false teachers, and they had themselves in a mess. But their mindset had been, well, Paul, he's not really an apostle, he's not really a man of God because he doesn't collect money, he doesn't ask us for money. And Paul's been telling them, listen, that's not what a godly individual does. A godly individual doesn't show up and say, okay, show me the money or I'm not preaching. That's not what godly individuals do. And so Paul is trying to get these Corinthians to understand that, listen, I'm the parent, I'm coming with the attitude and the mindset that I am going to bless you guys. That's a good thing, isn't it? It's a good thing. When dad shows up from work, and maybe he's got like a pink box or a white box, and in there, man, there's like donuts or pastries or something, And he's showing up with like, hey, it's good to see you guys. Woo, let's go. Let's hurry up and have dinner so we can hurry up and have some donuts or whatever. Or, he's coming with some kind of gift. That's a good thing. It's a fun thing. That's a pleasurable thing. And so he wants the Corinthians to know, listen, it's the parents' responsibility to lay up or save up for the kids. So Corinthians, don't worry. I'm coming with the mindset of giving. He goes from saving to spending. We like that part, right? We like the spending part. It's funny, like when my kids were younger and they didn't have jobs because they were too young to work, and so they had access to my money. They had dad's money, and they were so generous with my money. They just wanted to give it away to everybody. And then it's so funny how as they got older and then they got their own jobs, how stingy they became. That's my milk in the refrigerator. And because some of you guys know me fairly well, and I'd be like, that's your milk in the refrigerator. Like, yeah, you drank some of it, I'd go over to the kitchen, I'd look in the fridge, I'd be like, I do not see your milk in here. What are you talking about? That's my milk right. Oh, really? Because it just says like whole milk. I don't see your name on there at all. Yeah. Well, that's my milk. Oh, okay. Well, I had some because, dad tax, right? Somebody was telling me about the dad tax. And then I would be like, listen, if you don't want me drinking your milk, that's okay. But why don't you take it and put it in your fridge? Oh, you don't have a fridge? Oh, okay. Well, maybe you should then why don't you take it to your house or your apartment, go put it in your fridge? Oh, you don't have one of those either. Oh, you live in it's my fridge. Oh, I'm paying for the electricity to keep your milk cold. By then, they were like, forget it, you can have whatever you want. It was like, I don't, just take it. I don't want to hear the lecture, So funny how stingy they became. Paul's talking now about spending. Verse 15, he says, and I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls. This is Paul's attitude. And family, in case you do not understand, we've talked about this several times over the last several weeks. Listen, your spiritual leader, if your spiritual leader, your pastor is me, and I'm looking around, and most of you, yes, that's you come here often. You regularly attend. I ought to be giving to you more than I am taking. Okay? I'm not here to take from you. But if this is not your youth group and not your home church, or you just like you don't like me and you want to go somewhere else, that's okay. I wouldn't like me either. But if you go somewhere else and you go to a different church or different youth group and you have a pastor there, a youth pastor, just so you know, this is a characteristic of a spiritual leader. This is an attribute of a spiritual leader, that person gives more than they take. What did Paul say? Verse 15, and I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls. That should be a characteristic of your spiritual leader, your pastor. They should be giving to you more than they are taking or getting from you. Now, Paul does go on. He's, again, this is a situation for parents here. Verse 15, I've got to be careful. I've got to mention this and then I've got to move on. I don't want to get bogged down here. But he says, and I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls, though the more abundantly I love you, the less I am loved, he tells the Corinthians. It kind of seems like that. Listen, believe it or not, I used to be young a long time ago, okay? And I used to live with parents, okay? I wasn't born a pastor, you know, like, oh, weren't you just born, you know, a pastor or whatever? And what's that?
You were born a janitor.
That's right, yeah, janitor. Yep. I loved being a janitor.
Oh, yeah.
Loved. Yeah, no, I love being a youth pastor way better. Yeah, way better. Yeah. But here's the thing, as parents, oftentimes you love your kids, and the more that you love them, sometimes it seems like the more love you're getting in return from your kids. Now, I have a theory. This is genuine. I think what happens is that for a lot of us in here, for a lot of people, kids, you got parents. You take your parents for granted. And here's what I mean. I don't mean that you dislike them, that you hate them, any of that. But when you're younger, your assumption is that your parents, you know that your parents love you. Hopefully you know that, okay? They love you. And your assumption is that your parents are just always going to be there for you. They're always going to love you. And you're right. Your parents, generally speaking, your parents love you unconditionally, don't they? They love you through all of your mess, all of your attitude. They love you. And sometimes what happens as being the son or the daughter, you just kind of take them for granted. Like, well, that's mom and dad. Yeah, sure, I love them. They'll always be there. So, I'm going to go spend all my time with my friends. Or, I'm going to go into my room and I'm not going to come out for family night or whatever. Because your assumption is they're always going to be there, which is a false assumption. That's inaccurate. Your parents are not always going to be there. Now, maybe as long as they're alive, they're going to be there. But one of these days, and it's going to come way too soon. Mark my words, it will come way too soon. Your parents will be gone. And then there will be some regret in your heart. And you'll say, man, I wish I would have spent more time. I can remember I wasn't saved when I was a teenager. I got saved when I was 20. And all of a sudden at 20, it was like reunited with my family. I mean, I still lived with my family, but I spent so much time out with my friends and partying and doing whatever that I missed several years. And I'll give you an example. I can still remember, I do not have a very good memory, but I can still remember one instance where now I'm a Christian and now I'm hanging out with my family again, and I'm loving it. And they were my family, my parents and my sisters. They were talking about a trip to the zoo. And they're like, oh, yeah, I remember we was at the San Diego Zoo and, such and such happened. And I was like what? I was thinking, I don't remember that. And I said, I don't remember that. And they went, oh, no, that's because you weren't there. And then they just went on telling the story and laughing about the story. And all of a sudden it hit me. It was like, man, like I wasn't saved. and I just kind of took my family for granted, and just, oh, they're always going to be there. I got to hang out with my friends because they're always going to be there. And I realized that I had missed precious time with them. And then many years later, when I was many years, not a lot of years later. It was a long time ago, but it wasn't long after that my mom got sick. My dad had left the family, and then my mom got sick, and she ended up passing away. And it was like all of a sudden, I got no parents. I think my dad's still out there somewhere, but I don't know where he's at. I haven't talked to him in, it's probably been 15 years or something. I don't know. Last time I saw him, he was in a hospital bed. And it comes and it goes so fast. And then you're going like, oh man, so what, I wish I would have spent, I like my friends, but I wish I would have spent less time with them. Spent time with them, but just less time, and then more time with my family. But it's hard. And Paul is saying here, listen, it seems like the more abundantly that we love you, the less we're loved back. And maybe that's because the Corinthians, well, we know the Corinthians were struggling, and they were kind of rejecting Paul, but maybe they also understood that Paul really did love them, and it's kind of like, oh, yeah, okay, he loves us, whatever. But Paul was feeling like, man, I feel like I'm giving you all my love, and I'm not really getting much. I'm getting less and less in return. And verse 16, but be that as it may, I did not burden you. And then he says this in verse 16, nevertheless, being crafty, I caught you by cunning. Now, he's used some sarcasm before, and I think he's using it again here. He's telling them, look, it wasn't burdensome to you, but some of you still think that I was just tricking you and catching you. That's what he's saying in verse 16. Verse 17, he asks them a question. Did I take advantage of you by any of those whom I sent to you? Did I send guys to you that were ripping you off? He says, I urged Titus and sent our brother with him. Did Titus take advantage of you? Did we not walk in the same spirit? Did we not walk in the same steps? Didn't Titus treat you well also? He and I, we worked the same way. We didn't take any money from you. All we did was give. Verse 19, again, do you think that we excuse ourselves to you? In other words, do you think we're defending ourselves with you? We speak before God in Christ, but we do all things, beloved, for your edification. Beautiful, heartfelt verses. Paul is pouring out his heart, letting his spiritual children, the Corinthians, know exactly what he's thinking, exactly what he's feeling. He doesn't finish, but he finishes that little section there in verse 19. Look what he says. He says, we're not defending ourselves in front of you. We speak before God in Christ. God is our witness, he's saying. We haven't ripped you guys off. We love you guys, is what he's telling the Corinthians. And then in verse 19, look at the last half there. But we do all things, beloved, for your edification. Does anybody know what edification means? Anybody know what edification? I think I saw Jada's hand first.
Like building up.
Yes. If you've ever heard the word edifice, it's a building, the edifice. Normally it's talking about the front of the building, the way it looks, but edification means building up. And Paul says there in verse 19, everything we do was done, beloved. He calls them beloved. They're turning their backs on Paul, and he says, beloved, everything I do is for you, for your edification. Just put a little reminder in your mind. Just stick it in there somewhere. Years from now, when you have your own kids, you'll experience that. Like, man, I'm loving these kids. Everything that I do, I go to work every day, and I'm doing this and doing that. Everything I do is for these kids. And man, it seems like the more I love them, the more they're off and away from me, and the more they don't want to be around me. And sometimes it seems like that. And Paul is feeling that here. Everything that we do is for your edification. I've got, again, you guys all know, some of you know my kids, which aren't really kids anymore. They're childish adults, or adult children, I mean. But they when they were in high school, they all played different sports. And, I went to as many games and water polo matches and cross country meets as I could, or, track meets, or, swim competitions, anything that I could. If I could get there, I'd get there, and I'd go yell and I'd scream. And I've explained to you guys before, when my kids were running, cross country, and I'd be like at the starting line, yelling at them, and then they'd take off, and I'd run to the next checkpoint and yell at them as they were coming by, and then I'd run over here as fast as I could, and as they're running by, I'm yelling at them again, go, 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 go the whole time. I did that not because my kids loved me, I did it because I loved them. Whether they wanted me there or not, and I believe that they did, they used to thank me for going, especially because the neighborhood that we grew up in and the area, the city that we were in, there were not a lot of parents there. The school that they went to, not a lot of parents. And so they would thank me for coming. But I wasn't doing it for them to thank me. I did it because I loved them. And even if they didn't like me, or if they didn't want me there, I was still planning to go because I loved them. Paul is explaining and pouring out his heart and saying, listen, everything that we do is for your building up. Man, Corinthians, we want to strengthen you. We just want to build you up. We want you to be better. Now Paul talks in verse 20 down to the end, verses 20 and 21, about possible problems with this visit. He's explained, listen, we're coming with some parental provision. We're saving up. And we're laying it up, and we're going to spend it on you, because we love you guys. But now he says, listen, when I come, and he uses the word fear in verse 20. We'll get there in just a minute. Now he says, but when I come, I'm hoping there won't be any of these problems. Some possible problems, verse 20. For I fear lest when I come, I shall not find you such as I wish, and that I shall be found by you such as you do not wish. So Paul says, man, I am hoping that when I come for a visit, it's a good visit, and I hope that we find each other in good standing. And he's saying, I hope I don't show up and find you guys with all of these problems. Now, these are problems that they had been dealing with for a long time, and Paul's going to list them off here. These are not just possible, like, well, maybe. No, these are things that they had been doing, and Paul is hoping that they're all done with these problems. Now, we'll see that here. Look what he says in verse 20. There are several words here. The first one he uses is, lest there be contentions. Contentions means arguments or fights. That was the church at Corinth. And in these verses, especially if you haven't been here for our study through 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, you're going to get a really good idea of what the church at Corinth looked like, what kind of problems they had in the past. Contentions. There was arguments going on, fighting going on in the church. Some of you might remember, I shared with you several years ago, I went to another youth group because we had a band, not here, this is from a previous youth group that I was at, but we had a bunch of guys that were in a ska band. And they went to go play at another youth group. So we went to go support. Say, yeah, all youth leaders show up. And we got there, and as we're walking in to this youth group, it was at a church, there were two guys out in the parking lot, two students out there fighting. It's like a little crowd around them, you know how that goes, oh yeah, whatever. And it's like, man, what in the world is going on with these youth groups? Well, this church at Corinth was like that. People were arguing, fighting. He then mentions not just contentions, but jealousies. We know what jealousies is, right? People being jealous of one another. He mentions outbursts of wrath. That actually means hot anger. It means that they would have these outbursts of wrath or outbursts of hot anger toward one another. The next thing that he mentions, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions. That actually means, in our modern day vernacular, we would say jockeying for position. You know what that means? Jockeying for position? It means that they were in competition with one another to see who was the best, to see who was the big dog or the big cheese or the, the boss man, boss lady, whatever you want to call it, if you speak Spanish, the barriga, it's like the big, it's the big cheese. And so in the church, they were jockeying for position. It actually is a phrase that is related to like running for office, like a political office. And we're all familiar with politicians, We'll leave it at that. How nasty that world can be, and everybody's competing with one another. That this was something that had been going on in the church. Everybody's trying to get the top spot. Trying to be the most important in the church. He goes on to say backbitings and whisperings, which are essentially the same thing. Backbiting, I think you probably know what that means. Man, he's like a backbiter. And whisperings, it means secret slander and character assassination. It means that you say things behind another person's back that you wouldn't say to their face. Saying bad things behind another person's back that you wouldn't say to their face. When they're not around. Oh, hey, they come around. Hey, how's it going? Oh, yeah, good to see you, brother. Good to see you, bro. And then as soon as they walk away, oh my gosh, that guy, he's such a loser. Or, that girl, oh, did you see the way she was dressed? Or, whatever. That is, it's the backbiting or whisperings is secret slander, character assassination, tearing somebody down. Tearing somebody down. Talking about them behind their back, destroying them. Not to their face, but once they walk away, once they're not there, then you just rip them apart. Conceits, so contentions and jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, backbitings, whisperings, and conceits. That means pride. They were prideful with one another. The Son of Man, Jesus said the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. Humility, not these guys. They were being prideful with one another. And then finally, tumults. That means chaos. It means confusion. It means that it's just unorganized and it's just all out of order. I mean, think about all of these words. Look at this. Arguments and jealousies, hot anger, jockeying for position, secret slander, character assassination, pride, confusion. These were all terms that had described the Corinthian church in the past. And Paul is now saying, I'm getting ready to come for a visit, and I hope that all of these things have been dealt with. And I hope we can move on. I hope these are not an issue anymore. But I want you to think about that. Think about that list. This is certainly not a perfect youth group. I'm partial. I think it's the greatest youth group, in the world. But it certainly is not a perfect youth group. And we certainly have had people come here. I've been here for now 4.5 years. And we certainly have had people come here and then, and then I get a call or an email from a parent, my son, or I don't know why, but oftentimes it's a daughter. My daughter was there and nobody said hi to her. And she said everybody was in cliques and, it was, nobody was nice to her. It's like, well, I am so sorry about that. We're not a perfect youth group, and those things are not excusable just because we're not perfect. But I don't know. We'll try. We'll try harder. We'll try better. But listen. Compare our youth group, our youth ministry to this church. Arguments, jealousies, hot anger, jockeying for position, secret slander, character assassination, pride, confusion. There may be some of those things evident here in the youth group, but as we compare ourselves to the Corinthians, it seems like we're doing pretty good. Now, maybe the Corinthians aren't the right ones to compare ourselves to because they were pretty much a hot mess. But imagine that. Imagine going to church and it was characterized by arguments, jealousies, hot anger, jockeying for position, slander, character assassination, pride, and confusion. I mean, why in the world would you even go there? It's like, why would I want to do that? But these are Corinthians that are coming out of the Greek world. These are worldly people. There were ex-thieves in there. There were ex-prostitutes there. Ex-slaves there. This is a rough crowd. And Paul has been patiently dealing with them for both 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. And now, hey, I'm coming for another visit. And I just hope that all of these things are dealt with. Verse 21, he finishes this chapter by saying, lest when I come again, my God will humble me among you. We'll talk about what that means in just a minute. And I shall mourn for many who have sinned before and have not repented of the uncleanness, fornication, and lewdness which they have practiced. We'll talk about that too in just a minute. But verse 21, lest when I come again, my God will humble me among you, Paul says. Why would God be humbling Paul among the Corinthians if he went for a visit? Well, if Paul showed up and all of this nastiness, the arguments and the jealousies and the hot anger, all of that stuff, if that was still evident, then Paul would be, in a sense, humiliated. Oh man, trying to work with this church and all this mess is still going on. So he describes it as God. He says, if I come and God has to humble me, in your presence, because all of this stuff is still going on. Because he sees himself as their spiritual father. Not heavenly father. He's not putting himself in the place of God, but just spiritually he led them to the Lord. And then finally in verse 21, he says, and I shall mourn for many who have sinned before and have not repented. They've not turned away of the uncleanness. Okay? These uncleanness, fornication, and lewdness all have to do with sexual sin. As if the confusion and the pride and all of those things that we just mentioned weren't enough, the Corinthians were involved in sexual sin. Uncleanness. That's impurity. They were impure people in heart and in mind and with their bodies. Again, they're in the Corinthian world, the Greek world. The human body is worshipped. Sex is seen as that's just a natural thing, and you got to partake of it, and fulfill those animal instincts. And the church is trying to function right in the middle of all that Greek, madness. Uncleanness, fornication is sex outside of marriage in any instance, in any form. And then lewdness, which they have practiced. They've done that. Lewdness. Lewdness essentially means sexual sin just out in the open. They're just lewd. They just show it. They promote it. I mean, we see that kind of a world right now, don't we? You don't have to scroll very far through your, in your social media feed, to see some, entertainer or musician, some young lady just, with barely any clothes on a stage, just shaking every part of her body. It's lewdness. It's just out there in the open for everybody to see. It's not hidden. They're not embarrassed by it. In fact, it's a pride thing. They got it out there. And who can show the most? Who can reveal the most? That's lewdness. And Paul condemns it here, and he condemns it in the church. These things ought not be taking place. Listen, we're not a perfect youth group, that's for sure. And we all have some responsibility, that when we see these issues rising up in our youth group, we need to say something, not just let it go. Because if it's just under the surface and nobody wants to say anything, I don't really feel like it's my place. No, we in love need to talk to one another and say, hey, whoa, that's not right. You can't be bringing that in here. You can't be doing that. And we need to share with people in love. That's what Paul is doing here. He's treating the Corinthians like he's a parent. He says, I'm coming for a visit. I love you guys. Let's deal with this stuff. Let's get it out of here. It shouldn't be in the church. Father, thank you so much for Paul's heart.